Welcome to Eviliv, the live media commentary show that answers the question, can you ever be known as an individual after a life of activism and conservation? Subscribe to the channel because today we are going to review The Wild Muir, 22 of John Muir's greatest adventures. So my initial thoughts, this is a bit of a weird, I'm not sure how to start this. So I was reading those werewolf books that I had recently reviewed a couple weeks back or so, and they reference a place in Northern California, which is like Muir Woods or something like that, something to that effect. And then I remembered that my mother had actually gone, I think maybe it was the Redwoods or somewhere, and she picked up this book and she got it for me and wrote a little inscription and everything because she knows that I love going out in the outdoors and I love going into the mountains and stuff. And I love nature. And so she thought, well, this is a guy who is known, John Muir, for doing like massive work in order to create national parks, fund the Sierra Club or create the Sierra Club. He cares deeply about nature and conservation, et cetera, et cetera. So my son must love that because they sort of, have the same kind of philosophy. And then there's like stupid tangential connections, like he's a Scottish American and my ancestry is Scottish. That doesn't matter at all, but I still kind of, tongue in cheek enjoy it. So my initial thought of this is I had to slog my way through it. There's something about writing styles that resonate with me and don't, right? This guy is an incredible outdoorsman. He has done things that I will never in my entire life conceive to do. He has survived tragedies and calamities that anyone else would have died. And the sheer number of them in his life almost blows your mind when you read about them. And a lot of people just don't believe any of it's true because some of it is just so outlandish and out there and so much of it built up over a lifetime that it's kind of hard for people to sort of rationalize. So my initial thoughts are he had an amazing life, incredible adventures. He did brilliant things for North America, but he sucks at writing. He's known as a mountaineer and a writer, but I really don't enjoy his style of writing. I think it's hot garbage. And it's wonderfully juxtaposed in one of the latest stories in this collection of his, where it's his version of a story compared to the person he was with and their version. And the person he was with was infinitely better. His writing was engaging and exciting, and it drew me in, and it made me want to read more. And how did you survive? And what did John do next? And I really cared. But every time I read this dude, John Muir's writings, I'm just like, oh, it's so matter of fact. I went to the mountain, and it provided me with a glimpse of nature so breathtaking. And then I climbed more, and I saw a crevasse, and I walked across the crevasse. And it's like, shut the fuck up. Take a creative writing class, dude. Because if you're trying to engage people in your shit, you have to entertain them. I don't want to read a textbook. That's not fun. People in school who have to read textbooks don't want to read textbooks. Why the fuck would anyone want to do that on their own time? It makes no sense. And I can't imagine how this guy is known as a writer. Oh, all right. Those are my initial thoughts. Hey, Chris, how you doing, man? Picture is very flattering. Well, first of all, this image here is one of the stories. And I don't even know why it's a story. All of these stories are more like anecdotes because they're very short, they're very brief, there's a lot of lead up, and then when it gets to the point of the story, it just drops off, and then he ends it. And you're just like, what the fuck did I just read? Why even bother? Ugh. I only read it out of guilt because my mom bought it for me. And so I was like, if she ever asks if I read it, I could lie. I lie all the time, but I like reading. And so maybe it's good. And after 100 pages, I was just like, this is balls. This is the worst. Horrible. All right, so before I get into the actual review and details of this work of memoir, I'll get into it in a second. But before I get into that, I do want to remind everyone that you can always subscribe to this channel if you're not already. That's a thing that I appreciate. And also we have apparel and we have memberships on this channel now. So if you want to get some Eviliv merch, it's out there. There's a link in the description. If you want to pick up some, if you want to support the channel either just as someone who wants to support the archival information or on a higher level tier of creating new content, those membership options are out there, and I genuinely appreciate you if you take the time to check it out. All right, let's get into this. I'm not going to take too long because I want to eat, and I have food coming here. All right, so ostensibly, this is just a selection of Muir's writings with brief introductions by Lee Stetson. I think this was a cash grab for Lee Stetson personally. He's an actor. He does a lot of plays of like John Muir's life. And he brings no added context or value in any way to anything. He just sets up the anecdote that you're about to read. And it's like, okay, this is where John almost fell into the river and drowned. You're like, okay, why did you need to tell me that? I could have just read the fucking anecdote and it would have just told me in John's own words. Like, what is it that you bring to the table with your introductions that somehow justifies this entire piece of this book? And I just don't get it. So he's garbage. The best part of this, hands down, 100% the best part of this book are the woodcut illustrations done by Fiona King. She's a great illustrator. These illustrations are great. And each story has its own sort of leading image that's like the full page. And they're all beautiful. I love woodcut imagery. I think it's beautiful personally. It's something that I've always dug. This is published by Yosemite Conservancy on March 12th, 2013. So it is relatively-ish new. My mind, this is crazy, because I don't think 2013 is that far away, but it's like over a decade away. It's like 11 years away. And so, hey, it's March 13th today, and that was March 12th. So, wow, we're almost at the anniversary. Or we just passed the anniversary. That's interesting. Anyway, I still think that 2013 is like yesterday. I don't think it's like a decade away, you know? When I see like books published in 2000, I'm just like, that's not very long ago, is it? And I was like, oh yeah, that was 24 years ago. That is a long time ago. That's proof that you're getting old, by the way, when you don't think a decade ago is a long time or 2 decades ago is a long time. That's my life. All right. You're always amazed at the time before accessible news sources nationwide that any written works became popular. Yeah, well, it's also just I don't think there was as many, you know? I mean, with self-publishing, we are buried in potential great and horrid writing. And so, you know, back in the day, the only way you could get published is if a publisher published your work. Self-publishing was so difficult. Or you went to a zine or a little fiction book or something like that, like a national or Reader's Digest or something like that. Like you had to have an established existing person publish it, not just, I wrote my own memoirs as some 22-year-old. They're like, I'm going to publish it. You just can't do that. Or you couldn't. So I don't think it was that big of a deal back in the day, but certainly now. Yeah. Anyway, I'm not going to go through all these. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. This is selections of his writings from across his entire life. So he's known as a mountaineer and for mapping and exploring locations all around North America, including Alaska. Well, let's just talk a little bit about John Muir. So he lived April 21, 1838 to December 24th, 1914. So a long time ago. And if you imagine what the 19th century would be like for a man on his own to go through mountaineering, the Rocky Mountains, the Yosemite Valley, and up in the glaciers of Alaska and stuff. Our country was only founded in 1776. Like, the whole Western expansion was about genocide of native peoples. That was the time he was going out and do this. People think of the Wild Wild West. That was the era he was climbing mountains and like exploring glaciers. So this was not a time when you could run down to your local sports store and buy all the equipment you need. Like, he was genuinely out there in like nothing but one layer, maybe wool clothing, and like a pickaxe. And like in some of these stories, he just had a piece of bread that morning and he was gone for days. So this is a guy who, if you ever see like images of him black and white, he looks emaciated. I mean, he almost looks like a Holocaust survivor. He's so thin and just drawn in. He doesn't look healthy at all, but it's because of his active lifestyle and just the era. One of the things that I always am so shocked by is the fact that nowadays, if the temperature is like 69 out of 70 degrees that you may be used to, you're like, oh, it's freezing in here. What is wrong? How can I possibly be expected to work in a freezing cold environment like this? Meanwhile, cut to like 1875, John Muir sleeping out on a glacier in freezing ice hail. Like, he didn't bitch and moan and complain. His era, you just lived with weather because you had no choice. It wasn't like you could, in my car, I can hyper specify my side of the car to be 65 and my wife's side of the car to be 76. And it's constantly, ebb and flowing and adjusting. Shit like that didn't happen. No heated seats. You're freezing to death and you just adapted and climatized to whatever climate you were in. Acclimated is the word I was looking for. And that's all you did. That's just how you lived. There's a story in here where he's talking about how he had this sore throat because he was living in the lowlands of California for too long. And so he went up in the upper glacial areas of the California mountains, and the bacteria in his throat couldn't survive because it was so freezing that he had to stay up there long enough for it to die out, and he no longer had a cold. I think his perspective is silly and ridiculous, but that was the mentality in the day. Back then. It's just so crazy. We could not survive in the 19th century. 24 human beings, if they tried, there would be so much bitching and moaning and whining and crying that your mother would murder you. Like, she wouldn't want to hear it if she was from that era. No one would want to hear it. Your dad would hit you with a belt at best, and probably a switch. You would get your teeth knocked out by the other people, just your neighbors, for being a pussy. Like, that's just how the life used to be. And these stories live up to that and sort of pay that off. And so that stark contrast I found interesting because it's real. But the stories, his writing's just not all that great. Anyway, so he is also known as John of the Mountains and Father of National Parks. He was a Scottish-born American, naturalist, author, environmental philosopher, botanist, zoologist, glaciologist, and eventual advocate of the preservation of the wilderness in the United States. He led tours for presidents across the mountains in order to help form like national parks. He was helpful in establishing the Yosemite National Park. He co-founded Sierra Club. He's published over 300 articles and 12 books. California celebrates a John Muir Day, April 21st of each year, which was first signed into legislation in 1988 and became effective in 1989 and onward. And there's just a lot of places named after this guy who had this seminal life that is hugely influential in the preservation of nature and the written experience and understanding of natural environments. And so his work is just incredible. I just wish he had like someone going with him and writing for him. Maybe I'm just being too rough. I don't know. So, it goes from stories like, and maybe this is arguably the worst part about all this. It's prefaced by this author who is giving the introductions as bloviating how huge and exciting and expansive this guy's life is. But the 21 stories that are presented in this, or anecdotes that are presented in it, don't really sell the grandeur and suffering and shock and explosive life that this guy had. It just talks about a few of his experiences. And you can't lead with saying, no one ever believed anything he ever wrote because he did so many amazing things. He was so close to death so many times. And then give us those samples and they're underwhelming. Because then now we're like, well, now it just sounds like you're blowing him up because you play him, on stage. And so you want to feel more important than you actually are. You need borrowed equity from the memory of John Muir in order to make your life have any semblance of value. And guess what? You did a bad job. That's my interpretation anyway. If you want to feel old, the movie Back to the Future was made today. Oh, I didn't know that. Marty McFly would travel back. Oh, if it was made today, to the year 1994. Yeah. I grew up with that show. That was great. All right, so the first story in this is called Good Scoochers, and he's born Scottish, and so he born in Scotland. He was talking about how all of his family and everyone he knew over in Scotland believed in ghosts. And so there's just this time where they went and climbed up on a roof trying to find, or they heard, or whatever. Like it wasn't a very engaging story, but it was interesting in that it sort of set the stage for his excitement of investigation and outdoor activity. He climbed the roof. A friend of his almost fell off, and he had to save his friend. And I like to juxtapose that against the best story in this, which is later on when he actually is rescuing on Glenora Park one of the people he's hiking with, who he said, you probably shouldn't come with me because I'm like on a different level of mountaineering than you are, and I don't know if you can keep up. It's kind of dangerous. And the guy was like, no, I'm going to go. Don't worry about it. The dude ends up falling, dislocates both of his shoulders, and he's hanging on for dear life on this perilous 1,000-foot cliff. And John Muir has to figure out a way to get this guy not just off of the cliff edge, but way back to camp days away. It took them 3 days. They were both frostbitten. They had to put their feet in snow in order to de-thaw slowly. That's how bad off they were. And it's just amazing that he was able to rescue. And the whole time he was whistling and singing. He was cheery. He was upbeat. He wasn't down because of the weather, because of the situation. He wasn't depressed or sad or pissed off at the guy for insisting on coming and him having to be forced to save his life and take him back to camp. No, it was just another day on the mountain. And you know what he did? As soon as he healed up, he went right back out and did it again. That's all. That was who he was. He just didn't care. It was just like, look, this is my life. I'm going to spend it in the mountains. And I can madly respect that aspect of his life. Anyway, it was such a good story. I think there's other stories where he almost drowned as a kid swimming. And so rather than developing this fear of water, that very night that he drowned, he went back into the water. His parents never taught him how to swim. He had to figure out on his own. And he went to the exact place and tried to set up the exact circumstance where he almost drowned in the middle of the night, and relived the whole experience so that he could get over his fear. This is a person who worked, his father made him work, kids back in the day, from sun up to sundown and sometimes more. He had to dig a well 70 feet deep by himself as a young child. He was 8 or 9 years old, and his dad would just lower him into the well and say, keep digging, son. And when he hit bedrock, he gave him a chisel. He had to chisel through limestone, meanwhile stirring up poisonous gases that are dormant in our earth. And he almost died from that too. And somehow he lived from that poison gas. And all these miners who lived nearby were like, you're so lucky. You should not go back down in there. And here are ways that you can sort of get rid of the gases while you're still trying to dig out the well. And he ended up digging the well because he had no choice, because his dad told him to. And that's what life was like. We always have to remember that if you're a homesteader back in the day, or a farmer before the Industrial Revolution really came into your life, You had multiple kids, not because you loved children and you wanted to have kids, but because they're workers. They would work your land. That was the point of having a lot of kids, and the death rate for people was really high. So you would have kids dying from colds and, as infants, so you had to have a lot more kids. So you get as many kids as possible. The boys, you're really happy you had because they could work the fields. The women, not as happy, but then you could sell them off. That's what a dowry is, everyone, to some other family to, for their husband or their potential, their son, so that they could have, a family of their own and have tons of kids of their own. Like, you kept the sons so that you could have them work the land. You sold off the women so that, you would get income from it, but also they could go make families and have kids. You would have guys back in the day with like their third or fourth wife, and she was young because all the other wives died in childbirth. It's just like the normal thing you did back in the day. It's so shocking when you really start thinking about how our life is now compared to just a century and a half ago. It is black and white difference. It's shocking. All right, so he like rode an avalanche. I don't know how severe and exciting the avalanche was, but that was it. The image here, he was up in the mountains and a massive windstorm came in, and he was like, you know what? I've never actually seen the effects of a windstorm from up high in the trees. So he climbed a tree and he rode the wind in the waves, and he said he was getting like 30-degree differences in the due to the wind blowing the tree over with his weight on it and stuff. But that's just what he did. He was curious about what things were like and why they worked the way they did because no one else was before him, or at least no one else went to the extremes to figure stuff out like that than him. And so he would go and discover it. And that was it. It's amazing that he didn't get mauled by a bear or a pack of wolves or, killed by the native peoples. Like, he was just the most impressive mountain man of anyone that I've ever heard of. It's just, his writing doesn't live up to it. So that's like, he almost, he nearly died of lack of water going on an expedition with some other people he was guiding. Here's one that I thought was really actually kind of fun. I'm a dog person. So he was up on this expedition with a bunch of people in an Alaska glacier. And before anyone else got up, he got up, grabbed a piece of bread, ate it, and then just hit the trail. One of the other people brought this little tiny, like, almost like a wiener dog is the description, up with him. And the wiener dog insisted on following him. And he's like, no, go back. You can't make this. This is a glacier climb. You can't come. And the dog was just like, Stikeen was the dog's name. He's like, no, I'm going with you. I'm not going to leave. So he takes the dog with him up a glacier, past all these like pitfalls. They have to like jump through all these like breaks in the glaciers, which are incredibly dangerous. We always forget that glaciers are like living entities. Like, they move and they change dramatically, and you could just find yourself falling in a massive precipice and freaking dying and never be found again, ever, because glaciers actively move across the surface of our planet. It's amazing. So he takes this little like wiener dog basically up into this massive area. He is nervous and he's like having to cut footholes in these glaciers, trying to like lean up against it and chip away little holes so he can put his hand in it and to hold. And the dog is just like plop, 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 plodding along next to him. He has to go on the outside face of a glacier, cutting footholds the whole way in order to get to the other side. And the dog's terrified. Understandably, I would be the dog if I was there in real life. I'd be like, no, hell no. I can't climb that. What am I supposed to do? And so he starts going to get the dog, and the dog just like, fuck it, and climbs across the whole place that he just went. And as soon as he got to the other side, he was like visibly shaking, as Muir puts it. And he started running around because he was like, I'm alive. So excited that he made it. Great story. Anytime you add a dog in a story, it makes the story infinitely better. But like, if it was just him going up the glacier, okay, congratulations, you did what you always do. But because a dog was involved and the dog didn't want to do it and the dog almost died, well, that makes it great because the dog didn't die. He does one where he does goes on what's now called Muir Glacier in Alaska with this massive sled full of all of his gear and stuff that he had to keep under 100 pounds. And he would go for days. Not just like what I do for hiking and stuff with my family is I'll go up into the mountains for an afternoon. And then, we'll hike up to the top of the mountain and we'll come back home and we'll have some lunch. And we just had a great family outing. He goes for days with no preparation. There's like one time he was like mad snowstorm. He was laying on the sled covered with like a tarp or a blanket or something, like a wool blanket. And underneath he was creating little shavings in order to create a tiny, tiny little fire in a can so he could heat up water in another can so that he could have a warm meal of soup. And that was like glorious for him. Like, you're lucky you live at all. Like in any snowstorm on top of a glacier. And then on the way back, like he fell in, like the glacier itself, those like cracks. I'm horrible because I don't know the terminology, but the cracks in the glacier, it was like snowed over because water had filled up and he stepped on it and went right into the water. This is hypothermic, like in seconds water temperature. He gets out, pulls himself out, goes for another day until other people find him because they were worried they hadn't found or he hadn't come back yet after 3 days. Like, this dude has done some amazing shit. He should be dead. He should have frozen to death decades before he died, and he just keeps going. He's like the Energizer Bunny of mountaineers. It's amazing. I feel like it was a lost opportunity because a lot of these stories talk about how he is writing notes about new plant life and new geographical features in areas that haven't ever been noted before. But we don't get any of the images. I want to see the sketches that he's talking about drawing. Like, that's what I'm interested in. I don't care how rudimentary they are. I'm not going to judge him as an artist, but he's talking about that's why he's there and what he's doing and the motivation for him to go further and look at new things. Well, give us the damn sketches. Like, why withhold them? Especially if it's mentioned in the damn story. Ugh. All right, so usually I seemingly like a book, a movie more until your live reviews. This one seems the opposite. Yeah. Well, I like the concepts behind the stories. I like the character. He's a real person who was. John Muir. I think he's great. I think what he did is amazing. I think his skill in writing is atrocious. And I think the person who put the book together doesn't... I feel like he's riding on the coattails of John Muir, personally. All right. So the last one was he almost got crushed in an iceberg, which sounds like an amazing story, but it was just like, no, I was moving through a gap between an iceberg and it like snow started falling down, and then I got to the other side. And you're like, wait, what? Like, you led me with the title of nearly crushed by an iceberg, and the payoff wasn't exactly there. So what the hell? So anyway, if I'm judging the stories, I'm going to give it a wildly different review than like judging this book on this book's merit. And that's going to make sense here in just a second. So my favorite part of this was the dog story and like the guy who had his shoulders dislocating, he was like hanging over a 1,000-foot cliff. He wrote his version of the story, which was 8 times longer than John Muir's version. And it was wildly interesting. It was like a thriller. And you're just like, oh, is he going to survive? And you're like, oh yeah, I just found out he survived already. And he's writing this, so he has to survive. But like, it's really good. And it just shows you how bad John Muir's writing is in comparison. So those were my 2 favorite stories of this. My least favorite is his writing, full stop. It's just not good enough. He's not expected to be able to be all things. So why don't you get a ghostwriter? You describe, or you give him your version of the writings so that they're factually accurate, and let him creatively tell that story. You double check it in editing to make sure that it's true and it lives up to it, and then release it so people enjoy it. I don't know. And I guess people loved his writing. I'm just not one of them, man. So anyway, ultimately, I'm giving you a review, a rating of 2 out of 5 Evil Eyes. The writing was that bad, in my opinion. I cannot, for the life of me, recommend anyone read John Muir's writings in this collection because it doesn't live up to the hype. It's presented in a wildly different way than it's actually unfolds, and the quality is just not there. The content, the concepts, and the person are great, but this is not the collection for anyone who likes creative writing. So that's going to do it for my review of, I don't know, whatever the hell this book was called. I got to look again. It was just one thing. Of The Wild Muir, 22 of John Muir's greatest adventures. And that's the other part. This is called 22 of his greatest adventures. I'm expecting like bombastic, huge stuff. And while some of it was interesting, it didn't come across as greatest adventures. So if there's, he had like over 300 stories. Are the other ones worse than this? Because if they are, how the hell did they get published? Like there's no universe where this is that good. I don't know. Anyway, that's all I had. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this review. As always, like it or not, evil spelled backwards is live. Thanks for tuning live, man. I appreciate it. Until next time, get out there and be evil. And write well. All right, just take a class.